There's truly been a lot going on with the airline industry and specifically Boeing. What we see is with doors blowing off mid-flight, we've had tires falling off of planes as they leave the runway. We've also had engines catching fire mid-flight, and not only that, there was a cargo plane that burst into flames that had to make an emergency landing at the Miami airport. And all of these come at the behest of what? Boeing's failure to address quality control standards, and as we see, their whistleblower, who has recently been found not alive, well, this is something that he was consistently talking about openly, that they were defying the standards of what made it safest for the passengers that were flying in their planes. But no, Boeing went ahead and sidestepped these problems and went ahead and allowed these planes to be thrown out onto the runway anyways. Thus, we are experiencing so many issues in the current day. Now let's go ahead and throw it into this video. We'll be starting this off with the BBC, and here we see Boeing admits mistake over 737 MAX 9 door blowout. A mistake? This is way more than a mistake. This could have cost the lives of every single person on this plane. Thankfully, no one was sitting in the seat right next to the panel that blew out mid-flight, so no one was directly in harm's way by sitting there staring out the side of the jetliner as it was flying 400 miles an hour. We jump up here to see Boeing says it can't find documents on the door plug that blew off mid-air. I'm sorry, what? You can't find the documents nor the schematics that explain how this works? Utterly ridiculous. And now we jump onto another example of just utter turmoil being thrust upon Boeing and those who are sitting there in these planes. Flames seen shooting out of a Boeing 747, prompting an emergency landing in Miami. Cell phone video captured the plane fly across the sky with what appears to be a trail of fire behind it. The Federal Aviation Administration, which is already investigating Boeing, said it will look into the latest incident on an Atlas Air flight. And here you can see the actual footage itself of the plane with sparks and trails just going behind it, looking like it's releasing flares, like it's an AC-130. Well, we jump now over to something that I thought was just ever revealing in relation to those two stories. Boeing threatens to cancel Boeing 737 MAX 10 aircraft unless given exemption from safety requirements. Go ahead, ruminate on it, think about what that means. Now I want you to go ahead and watch this video and think about the fact of what this means in relation to many of the engineers who are working on these planes, openly stating that they themselves would not be willing to fly on them.
In Charleston are assembling the company's flagship product, the 787 Dreamliner. But this footage reveals some have little faith in the plane they build.
Did you fly on one? You won't fly on one. Did you fly on one of these planes?
No, not really.
Of 15 workers asked randomly, 10 said they would not fly on the Dreamliner.
I wouldn't fly on one of these planes because I see the quality going down around here.
An employee captured the footage after contacting Al Jazeera to tell us he had serious concerns about what he was seeing. At his request, we changed his voice.
With all the problems reported on the 787, there's 90% that's getting swept away. Hushed up. It's an iceberg.
In another meeting, the source told us workers are often underskilled, uncaring, and in some cases on drugs.
I've seen a lot of things that should not go on at an airplane plant. People talking about doing drugs, looking for drugs.
It's all coke and painkillers and what's that other one? You can get weed here. It's really good weed here. They don't drug test nobody.
I know they don't.
And there's people who go out there and lunch to go smoke one up.
Do they?
Hell yeah.
It's truly jarring when you listen to the actual engineers themselves say, no, of course, I would never fly on one of these planes. I know what goes into them. Something for you to consider. Now we jump on to RFK Jr.'s tweet. John Barnett worked for Boeing for 32 years. The company worked to destroy his life after he exposed safety concerns. I'm proud that my sister Rory worked to tell his story in her award-winning documentary Downfall, The Case Against Boeing. Boeing killed 346 people out of greed. Let's hope there's a genuine investigation of John Barnett's quote-unquote suicide. And now we jump over here to Eric Avenatti, and if you are unfamiliar with what is going on with the nature of, well, the death of 346 people on a Boeing plane, this footage will most certainly explain it to you. Boeing's infamous 737 MAX had a fatal flaw. leading to 2 deadly crashes killing 346 people. MCAS, an automated flight control feature that stabilizes the Boeing 737 MAX, operating on faulty data caused the failures. Boeing originally claimed that the pilots were at fault because they can shut off the systems and manually crank the sensor into position to wherever it can receive accurate data. Upon further review of the black box data, Boeing pilots followed protocol and still the deadly accidents occurred. Boeing would rather sweep this under the rug than prevent more deaths from occurring. In unrelated news, a Boeing whistleblower died March 9th. Yes, that's absolutely true. Boeing would most certainly rather sweep this under the rug than worry about the fact of causing the death of more innocent people. It's realistically going to take an airliner just detonating mid-air like the Challenger for Boeing to actually step up and address the fact of what's going on. Now let's go ahead and throw it into this footage.
We go second by second through these few minutes of this flight.
Going through the steps that the pilots had taken and saying, yep, I would have done that. Yep, I would have done that.
And as soon as they lifted off the ground, all these different alerts started popping up. The airspeed was unreliable, the altitude was showing unreliable, there were alerts related to that. But they bring the gear up and they continue to climb out.
2 minutes into the flight, based on faulty data from the AOA sensor, MCAS kicked in and began pushing the nose down.
And I have very clear memory of noting a time mark where the first officer is quoted as saying, "Stab, trim, cutout switches," which takes the weapon away from MCAS, which is what Boeing told us to do. And I have to confess, I probably swore. I said, the kid got it right. That kid got it right.
What had happened was the pilots did do what they were supposed to do. They had cut the electricity off.
Don't think.
They hit these switches and they tried to take manual control.
The first officer is reaching to this large wheel on his left, and that's the manual trim wheel, and trying to turn it. It's like lifting up a 10-ton bucket of cement out of a deep well.
The problem was, at that point, the plane was going so fast that even after they took manual control, they could not physically get the plane to right itself. They shouldn't have been going that fast.
Too low, terrain.
And they're continuing to accelerate towards the ground. The ground is approaching them.
Then, with no apparent recourse, the pilots reached for the stabilizer switches.
I'm yelling into the cockpit, don't do that. But I don't know what they're facing.
Caution, terrain.
MCAS was reactivated.
MCAS says, hey, I'm back on. Here we go. Zzz. And now the airplane is in near full nose down trim, and you can pull back forever. And there's not enough metal in the back of the airplane to make that airplane come up to a nose up.
Terrain, terrain. Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Truly makes you wonder how many more people they'd be willing to sacrifice at the behest of making sure their quality standards weren't up to code. Well, I'm sure one more couldn't hurt, especially if there were a whistleblower about to blow the lid on your whole operation. Let's go ahead and jump into this article from the BBC. A former Boeing employee known for raising concerns about the firm's production standards has been found dead in the U.S. John Barnett had worked for Boeing for 32 years until his retirement in 2017. In the days before his death, he had been giving evidence in a whistleblower lawsuit against the company. Boeing said it was saddened to hear of Mr. Barnett's passing. The Charleston County coroner confirmed his death to the BBC on Monday. Here's the interesting part about that death. It said the 62-year-old had died from a self-inflicted wound on March 9th, and police were investigating. Ah, self-inflicted, you say? Apparently he committed suicide in his truck in his hotel parking lot, which, go ahead, citizen, don't you worry about that. Go back to watching sports ball. Don't you mind this. There's nothing mysterious and foul about this play at all. Mr. Barnett had worked on the U.S. plane giant for 32 years until his retirement in 2017 on health grounds. From 2010 on, he worked as a quality manager at the North Charleston plant making the 787 Dreamliner, a state-of-the-art airliner used mainly on long-haul routes. In 2019, Mr. Barnett told the BBC that under-pressure workers had been deliberately fitting substandard parts to aircraft on the production line, which would perfectly explain all of the issues we've seen with so many of the Boeing planes as of late. He also said that he had uncovered serious problems with oxygen systems, which could mean 1 in 4 breathing masks would not work in an emergency. He said soon after starting work in South Carolina, he had become concerned that the push to get new aircraft built meant the assembly process was rushed and safety was compromised, something the company denied. He later told the BBC that workers had failed to follow procedures intended to track components through the factory, allowing defective components to go missing. He said in some cases, substandard parts had even been removed from scrap bins, fitted to planes that were then being built to prevent delays on the production line, which would perfectly explain all of the issues we've seen with all of these different Boeing planes as of late. He also claimed that the tests on emergency oxygen systems due to be fitted to the 787 showed a failure rate of 25%, meaning that 1 in 4 could fail to deploy in a real-life emergency. Mr. Barnett said he had alerted managers to his concerns, but no actions had been taken. Boeing denied his assertions. However, a 2017 review by U.S. regulators, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, did uphold some of Mr. Barnett's concerns. It established that the location of at least 53 non-conforming parts in the factory was unknown and that they were considered lost. Boeing was ordered to take remedial action. On the oxygen cylinders issue, the company said that in 2017 it had identified some oxygen bottles received from the supplier that were not deploying properly, but it denied that any of them were actually fitted on aircraft. After retiring, he embarked on a long-running legal action against the company. He accused it of denigrating his character and hampering his career because of the issues he had pointed out, and charges all of which were rejected by Boeing. At the time of his death, Mr. Barnett had been in Charleston for legal interviews linked to the case. Last week, he gave a formal deposition in which he was questioned by Boeing lawyers before he was cross-examined by his own counsel. He had been due to undergo further questioning on Saturday. When he did not appear, inquiries were made at his hotel. He was subsequently found dead in his truck in the hotel parking lot. Speaking to the BBC, his lawyer described his death as tragic. In a statement, Boeing said, "We're saddened by Mr. Barnett's passing and our thoughts are with his family and friends. His death comes at a time when production standards at both Boeing and its key supplier Spirit AeroSystems are under intense scrutiny." This follows an incident in as early as January when an unused emergency exit door blew off a brand new Boeing 737 MAX shortly after taking off from Portland International Airport. What we see is a preliminary report from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board suggested that 4 key bolts designed to hold the security door in place were not fitted. Last week, the FAA said a 6-week audit of the company had found multiple instances where the company allegedly failed to comply with manufacturing quality control requirements. And it makes you wonder how many more of these are going to be discovered. And it also makes you think about the fact of how heroic it is for someone like Mr. Barnett here to speak up against a company like Boeing, who is putting God knows how many lives at risk, all because they are not willing to acquiesce to quality control standards. This is a really important story for people to focus on because air travel is one of the most important mechanisms of traversal across the entirety of the planet. And if this is the case, God knows how many people's lives are being put at risk. Now let's go ahead and throw this into a clip of John Barnett, one of the first times he was on the media, talking about what was going on with Boeing's quality control standards and how they are failing those who they claim to serve, and that of, well, those who fly on their planes.
I've been to that Charleston factory. What do you think about this new news?
Well, one of the things you hear in all their factories is the sound of vacuum cleaners, and you'll see why. We have heard these kinds of complaints before, especially during the early startup days of the Charleston assembly line, and have seen ongoing tension between the company and its biggest union over efforts to organize the South Carolina factory. Tonight, hear from one of the people involved in the New York Times story, as interviewed by NBC News.
So quality is the last line of defense.
John Barnett says he spent 32 years with Boeing, and he's blowing the whistle on where he works, at Boeing's factory outside of Charleston, South Carolina. He points to this photo showing the type of metal shavings typically created when the floorboards of the jet are fastened down above the cargo holds. He says those shavings can gnaw through insulation on wires, leading to electrical shorts if not cleaned up, reminding us that the 787 is a fly-by-wire airplane.
I called up my senior manager, and we actually met on the plane, and I showed him we'd lowered a cargo ceiling panel, and it was just covered with metal shavings, and there was metal shavings and wire. And I showed him, I said, we got a problem, you know. And like I say, leadership decided that it would cost too much to remove the panels.
The 787 is the only Boeing airliner assembled in more than one location. Boeing started making them in Everett, then broke ground on a second assembly plant in North Charleston, South Carolina, about 10 years ago. Barnett says he spent much of his career in Everett, then, like many others, took an opportunity to move to Charleston, where he says he found a different safety culture.
In Everett, we could have said, hold on, you know, stop, and it would have gotten the proper attention. If you find a big problem like this, the people step up and they provide the resources to make sure it's fixed properly.
As you heard there from the horse's mouth itself, from John Barnett, claiming that this isn't an issue at every single airline production facility. No, This is something that is relegated to specific plants, and because of this, the people who are responsible should be held responsible. And in doing so, hopefully we will create better standards in the future so further lives will not be lost and more lives will not be put at risk. And I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I have no desire to fly on a Boeing plane. I have multiple flights I'm taking later this year. And the fact that I'm now sitting here thinking about the plane I'm going to be flying on is genuinely wild, when all I was thinking about before was the fact of trying to get to the destination itself. Now I have to worry about if the plane itself is going to turn into the Challenger on my way to the destination. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you for watching. If you got this far, thumbs up if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't. Tell me where I'm wrong in the comment section down below. Stay lovely, stay great, tell someone you love them. Peace out.